In the mid-19th century, a war erupted that would forever reshape North America. It was a conflict fueled by ambition, ideology, and contested borders. The Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848 did not just redraw maps, but it altered destinies. It cemented the United States as a continental power while leaving Mexico scarred, weakened, and stripped of about half its territory. This war, often overshadowed by the American Civil War that followed just over a decade later, remains one of the most consequential and controversial conflicts in American history. At the time, Mexico was a young nation, still struggling to stabilize after gaining independence from Spain in 1821. Politically fragile and plagued by internal divisions, Mexico had inherited vast lands, from California to Texas, but lacked the population, infrastructure, and military strength to defend them effectively. Meanwhile, the United States was surging with confidence and ambition. Its population was booming, its economy was expanding, and its political leaders embraced an idea that would come to define an era: Manifest Destiny, the belief that the U.S. was destined to expand westward across the continent, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. For many Americans, this expansion was more than geography. They portrayed it as a mission, even a divine right. But expansion also brought tension, especially with Mexico, whose lands stood in the path of America's ambitions. Nowhere was this tension more evident than in Texas. In 1836, Texas declared independence from Mexico after a bloody struggle, famously marked by the Battle of the Alamo. But for nearly a decade, Mexico refused to recognize Texas as an independent republic. When the United States annexed Texas in 1845, Mexico saw it as an act of aggression. Worse still, the two nations could not agree on where Texas ended. Mexico claimed the Nueces River as the boundary, while the United States insisted on the Rio Grande. This disputed strip of land between the two rivers became the flashpoint for war. So as 1846 dawned, two nations faced each other across a contested frontier, one young but fragile, the other young but rising. The stage was set for a war that would decide not only borders, but the very balance of power on the continent. And to understand why this war broke out, we must first explore its causes. Wars rarely erupt from a single spark. They result from long-simmering tensions. In the case of the Mexican-American War, four major forces pushed the United States and Mexico toward open conflict: the annexation of Texas, disputes over borders, the ideology of Manifest Destiny, and Mexico's internal instability. The first and most immediate cause was the annexation of Texas. After Texas won independence from Mexico in 1836, it existed as a self-declared republic for nearly a decade. Mexico, however, never recognized this independence, viewing Texas as a rebellious province that it would one day reclaim. When the United States annexed Texas in 1845, Mexico interpreted it not just as theft of territory, but as a direct provocation. The act poisoned diplomatic relations. For Mexico, it was an insult to sovereignty. For the United States, it was the fulfillment of destiny. But annexation was only the beginning. The United States claimed that Texas's southern border was the Rio Grande, extending deep into what Mexico considered its own territory. Mexico insisted that the true border lay further north, at the Nueces River. This disputed land between the two rivers was more than empty wilderness. It was a symbol of pride and sovereignty. To control it was to control the future of Texas. As U.S. troops under General Zachary Taylor marched into the contested zone, Mexico saw invasion where America saw defense. Beyond Texas, another force was at work: ideology. In the 1840s, many Americans embraced the idea of manifest destiny, the belief that the United States was fated, even divinely ordained, to expand across the continent. For expansionists, Mexico's vast northern territories, California, New Mexico, Arizona, were ripe for the taking. They dreamed of U.S. ports on the Pacific, new farmland, and new opportunities. President James K. Polk was one of the strongest advocates of this vision. To him, war with Mexico was not only likely, but it was necessary. Mexico, meanwhile, was politically fragile. Frequent coups, financial struggles, and leadership changes weakened its ability to respond decisively. While many Mexicans resisted U.S. aggression, the government lacked unity. Into this instability stepped a familiar figure, Antonio López de Santa Anna, who would once again shape Mexico's fate during the war. So, by 1846, the ingredients for conflict were all in place: a contested border, the annexation of Texas, an American hunger for expansion, and a Mexico, too, divided to resist effectively. All it would take was a spark. That spark came along the Rio Grande, where skirmishes between U.S. and Mexican soldiers ignited a war that would change the continent. The war began not with a formal declaration, but with bloodshed on contested ground. In April 1846, U.S. General Zachary Taylor moved his troops into the disputed zone between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande. For Mexico, this was an invasion. The Mexican cavalry attacked a U.S. patrol, killing and capturing several soldiers. When the news reached Washington, President James K. Polk seized the moment. Declaring that American blood has been shed on American soil, he asked Congress to authorize war. On May 13, 1846, the United States officially declared war on Mexico. Even before the declaration, the first major clashes had begun. On May 8th, U.S. and Mexican forces met at the Battle of Palo Alto, near present-day Brownsville, Texas. The U.S. Army, though smaller, had a decisive advantage: modern artillery. General Taylor's well-trained gunners unleashed devastating fire, shattering the Mexican lines. The following day, at Resaca de la Palma, Taylor pressed the attack. His troops overran Mexican positions, forcing them to retreat across the Rio Grande. These victories boosted American morale and gave the impression that the war would be swift and easy. For Mexico, it was a grim warning of the challenges ahead. With the Rio Grande secured, Zachary Taylor advanced deeper into Mexican territory. His first major target was the city of Monterrey, a key stronghold in northern Mexico. In September 1846, Taylor's army of about 6,000 men launched a three-day assault. Mexican defenders, led by General Pedro de Ampudia, fought fiercely, using the city's stone buildings as fortresses. Street-by-street combat turned Monterrey into a bloody battleground. But U.S. forces gained ground, forcing the Mexicans to surrender the city. Rather than imposing harsh terms, Taylor allowed the Mexican army to withdraw with honor. This decision angered President Polk, who wanted a more decisive blow. But Taylor's popularity at home soared, eventually propelling him to the presidency a few years later. Back in Mexico City, the defeats had deepened political instability. The Mexican government, desperate for leadership, turned once again to Antonio López de Santa Anna. Exiled in Cuba, Santa Anna struck a deal. The U.S. would allow him safe passage back to Mexico, expecting him to negotiate peace. Instead, once he returned, he rallied Mexican forces and vowed to resist the Americans at all costs. By the end of 1846, the war was fully underway. The United States had seized key positions in northern Mexico, but the conflict was far from over. Santa Anna's return meant Mexico was ready to fight back, and new campaigns were opening on other fronts, including California and New Mexico. The war was about to expand beyond Texas and northern Mexico into a continental struggle. While General Zachary Taylor fought in northern Mexico, the war expanded to other fronts. By late 1846, the United States was waging a continental campaign, stretching from California to the deserts of New Mexico and even to the Pacific Ocean. In California, tensions had been building for years. The region was sparsely populated with only a few thousand Mexican settlers, known as Californios, and a growing number of American immigrants. In June 1846, a group of American settlers launched the Bear Flag Revolt. They seized the town of Sonoma and declared California an independent republic, flying a flag emblazoned with a crude drawing of a bear. Their rebellion was short-lived, but it signaled U.S. ambitions in the region. Soon after, U.S. naval forces under Commodore John D. Sloat arrived and claimed California for the United States. By early 1847, U.S. troops, including those led by John C. Fremont and Stephen W. Kearny, secured control of California. Meanwhile, General Stephen Kearny led a separate expedition into New Mexico. Marching from Fort Leavenworth with the Army of the West, he crossed the plains and entered Santa Fe in August 1846 without resistance. The Mexican governor fled, and the city surrendered without a fight. From there, Kearny continued toward California, reinforcing U.S. forces already in control. With New Mexico and California secured, much of Mexico's far north was lost. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy established blockades along Mexico's Gulf and Pacific coasts. This cut off supplies, strangled Mexican trade, and allowed American forces to strike at will. Naval supremacy gave the United States a decisive edge, especially in distant regions where Mexican control was weakest. Yet Mexico was far from finished. In late 1846, Antonio López de Santa Anna, former president and military leader, returned from exile. With his charisma and reputation, he rallied thousands of troops, determined to defend Mexico's heartland. Santa Anna promised to drive out the invaders, and soon he and his army were preparing to meet the Americans head-on in central Mexico. By early 1847, the United States had gained California, New Mexico, and key victories in the north. But the heart of Mexico remained unconquered. To bring the war to a decisive end, U.S. leaders would need to strike at the very center of Mexican power, Mexico City itself, and that meant launching one of the most daring invasions in American military history. As I said, the United States had secured victories in northern Mexico, California, and New Mexico. But President James K. Polk wanted more than scattered successes. He wanted to force Mexico onto the negotiating table. To achieve this, he turned to General Winfield Scott, commander of the U.S. Army. Scott devised a bold plan: launch an amphibious invasion on Mexico's Gulf Coast, capture the port city of Veracruz, and march inland to Mexico City, the very heart of the Mexican Republic. That's it for today. We will talk about the U.S. invasion of Mexico City and the end of the war in the next video. Thank you.